Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm back with another brand new episode for the Leo Training Podcast. My guest this week is Alex Wolf. Alex is the head of strength and conditioning for the English Institute of Sport, where he leads a team of 60-plus strength and conditioning coaches working with the majority of Olympic and Paralympic sports for Team Great Britain. Alex spent almost 6 years working with Great Britain rowing, including the preparation for the 2012 London Olympic Games, where Great Britain rowing topped the medal table with their best ever medal haul. So here are 3 things that you'll learn from Alex in this exclusive interview. 1, evidence of strength training that shows an improvement in force development and power. 2, what skills or lifts give the best return to the rowing stroke. 3, technique versus load. Why going heavier does not always translate to greater force production. So, without further ado, let's roll to episode 98 with Alex Wolf. I am very pleased and excited to welcome on Learning Projects Lead and Strength and Conditioning Coach at the English Institute of Sport, Alex Wolf. And Alex is also the co-author of Training for the Complete Rower, A Guide to Improving Performance. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to come on to the Leo Training Podcast.
No problem. Thanks for having me, and sorry for getting you out of bed so early.
No, it's my pleasure. It's a great way to start off the day. So with that, why don't you share your background, I guess, as an athlete and a coach, and how you kind of got started in sport, and what led you down the path to become a strength and conditioning coach, and how you got involved with the rowing program in Great Britain.
Yeah, sure. So I think when I first started thinking about, I suppose, life after university and so on, strength conditioning in the UK didn't really exist. It was just fitness training, and I was working as a personal trainer and just trying to make some sense of what I really wanted to do. And I always knew I wanted to work with athletes, and being a failed athlete in many sports, I realised I was never going to make it as an athlete. So I was looking at alternative ways to stay within sport. So I initially started just doing strength coaching and fitness coaching for loads of different groups of athletes, whether it was endurance runners or tennis players, or the university rugby team and swimming clubs and so on. And slowly, kind of the emergence of strength conditioning really happened in the UK around 2003, 2004, just around the time I was finishing off my master's in biomechanics, and I was really kind of looking at kind of what careers there were around that. And at that point, the English Institute of Sport became the place for Olympic and Paralympic sport to work within most science, medicine and technology areas. And so I applied for an internship in 2004, I think it was, 13 years ago, and moved up to Sheffield in Yorkshire in the north of England, and started working with pretty much every Olympic, Paralympic athlete that we had that was based in the region. And then as I started kind of cutting my teeth a little bit more in that space, I kind of realised that I wanted to work more in a singular sport, and an opportunity came to move to full-time with athletics. So I moved back down to London, and spent 3 years during the Beijing Olympiad with them. And then in 2009, an opportunity, and most of this is luck rather than me being an outstanding individual at the time. But at the time, the head of strength conditioning for the rowing program became available. And I applied for it, and just coincidentally, it was the right time for the sport, the right time for me. And after, actually, it was a 3-month interview process. So they kind of got me working for them, and then decided after 3 months they did want me to work with them. And then I spent 5 and a bit years with them, delivering their strength conditioning for that period of time. So yeah, it was and I only stopped working with them in 2014, the end of 2014. So yeah, it's been a kind of a bit of a whirlwind of working with them, and then transitioning into the head of strength conditioning with the Institute, and then my current role as learning projects lead.
Fantastic. That's and that interview sounded pretty rigorous there. 3 months.
Yeah, I think why I say that's why I say I was lucky rather than the outstanding individual that I think or I'd like to be. I think they saw something in me when they originally interviewed me, didn't know quite what it was, and didn't totally trust that I could deliver what was needed. So I kept coming back, and I was doing this kind of dual role with athletics. So then athletics were kind enough to allow me to come and move to do some stuff with rowing, and I was there for a couple of days a week over that period of time, and then just at before the 2009-2010 season, they offered me the role. So yeah, I got to meet. The beauty of that was I got to meet all the coaches, all the athletes. I started to really understand the sport. So by the time I actually was given the job and went into that season, the 2010 season, like I kind of knew quite a lot about the sport, and that put me in a good pedestal. I wouldn't recommend it for anyone else. It's horrible, but looking back, like it did put me in a pretty good position to continue working with rowing.
Fantastic. And then just to come full circle, so your current role as learning projects lead. So how has that kind of transitioned from, I guess, doing more of the day-to-day hands-on strength and conditioning? What does that role have you doing now? What's the focus there?
Yeah, so while I suppose I spent 13 years working over in the coalface as a coach, or helping the coaches who are delivering it, my role now is much more on a much wider spectrum. So it's looking at the entire English Institute of Sport and the kind of the people development strategy and how we partner our coaches, and it's looking at all the non-technical development within the institute. So rather than being around the technical competencies to deliver I know some of the strength conditioning programs, it's much more about the expertise of the individuals and their ability to actually interact, engage, and align what they do with the coaches. So a lot of it's around personal leadership and followership, and a lot of it's around the type of leaders people want to be, how they can deal with the rigors of working in a high performance environment. So like effective communication, problem solving, decision making, and it's trying to provide an infrastructure and framework for the entire organisation, whether you're an operations manager through to a practitioner, to know what kind of non-technical development can help them be better at what they do. So it's putting this massive suite of opportunities on there. We're not talking necessarily just events, but it's kind of like if you go and do some training, what's the aftercare and what the other opportunities there are for you to continue to thrive in that. So if you're suddenly going to do some leadership training, you're not suddenly going to become a better leader after doing a 4-day or 5-day course. It's it takes years for that. So how do we help support them in the intervening years after that? So it's all this aftercare and communities of practice, and just helping these guys to find a safe way and an enjoyable way to develop and keep growing.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like you're really helping to develop that entire system and then all the individuals at each level.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's why I was so interested in it. I think with my role as head of S&C within the institute, I spent the last probably 3 years of it, that being my major focus, just with the strength conditioning coaches, and actually that was what I was doing there. Wasn't domain specific around strength conditioning. It was just it was generic enough for every type of person in our organisation, and probably every person on planet Earth, about just how we view ourselves, how we view the world, and how we interact with everybody. And that's a bit I probably am more passionate around that right now than most other things.
Very cool. Well, that's awesome that you find so much joy in what you're doing each day. That's great. So shifting gears into the S&C. So let's start off kind of 30,000 foot view in regards to rowing. So what makes rowing different, in your opinion, than other sports? And then kind of the training around that, like what's required for the athlete to be successful at a very high level.
the interesting bit for me, and this is what struck me when I first walked in, is the rowing is is often referred to as an endurance sport, pretty much because it lasts longer than 45 seconds. But endurance can be anything from a minute right the way up to wherever it is. But when you look at other events which last around 5.5 to 6.5, 7 minutes, and particularly on track athletes and so on, you look at the types of athletes that do that, and they're entirely different. You get these very nimble, lightweight athletes running around tracks, and then you have these huge monsters of rowers, and that's what struck me. And then when you look at their ability to produce force and create large degrees of power when they're on the ergos and so on, there's clearly a differentiation between those types of endurance athletes, and that's what I think separates them from traditional endurance athletes on potentially bikes and on foot. That they have this. Well, they're bigger. Like a heavyweight male can be over 100 kilos, and you'd never get a 5,000 meter running athlete at 100 kilos. But with that comes its massive rewards of just having more muscle mass to be able to produce more force. But you also have to carry that and move that mass while rowing. So I think that was the interesting bit, is that they are different in that sense. And that's really cool, because actually coming from a much more strength power background, working with track and field, that's kind of where my head naturally goes to, and some of the things you've seen some of the rowers do are way above that of what I've seen other endurance athletes I've worked with, and their capabilities of doing in the weight room, their force production and the ability to lift some real significant loads is pretty outstanding. And I think that's unique. That's that they're able to be these highly tuned endurance-based animals while also being able to produce some outstanding force and power characteristics, which you often see only in much truer strength and power events. So that's where I suppose the biggest difference is. The challenge you always have is particularly in the high performance programs is just the volume of work. So whenever you're training, like if you're trying to develop high force qualities and high power qualities, then you're always up against the amount of time they spend on the water or on the ergometer or doing some other kind of metabolic cross training based type of training, and that is where we're always going to come up against it. Mm-hmm. So that's probably where the challenge is, like how do you organise your training? It's not necessarily the type of training, but how do you organise the training to optimise the critical adaptation that you're looking for. So if you decide that they need to just be able to produce a little bit more force in their legs, are you really going to give those athletes the time, or the rowers the time to develop that? If the genuine priority is around aerobic fitness, because trying to do both of them simultaneously becomes really difficult, and you often become second fiddle to it. So that's a bit when I look at training and how you train for it, it's not necessarily any different to any other sport. It's just how you organise it and how you then prioritise what becomes the most important thing at any point in the season.
Yeah, I think that's a huge key you just hit on, and I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit deeper in a minute. But one thing I would love for you to touch on. So you talked about kind of some of the characteristics as an athlete that make rowers different. So is there like one example, like in person, that you can recall, whether it's in the strength and conditioning room or maybe an athlete was on an erg, where you saw them performing and you go, wow, okay, like this is, something in your mind that jumps out, like, wow, this is a different type of athlete, the amount of power that they're producing and able to sustain that for a long period of time?
I've been fortunate enough to work with probably some of the best rowers of their generation, and maybe some of the best rowers ever, I suppose, and that's been a real privilege to be able to work in the British rowing program and see that. So yes, I probably can. I think that the ones that really stick out for me is probably not so much of the open weights, but more of the lightweight programs. And you see some of what I've seen some of the lightweight men do is they'll be training the same training facility with, say, that the British hockey team, for instance, or some other groups of athletes who you'd normally traditionally say are high strength, high power, high speed based athletes. And you look at what the lightweight men were doing, and you couldn't tell that they were endurance athletes or rowers. You would say, well, actually, if you put them in a hockey kit, they could be those hockey guys. Some of the loads they were lifting, when we did some of the testing, the test results were comparable, if not better. And you're like, well, this is outstanding. And because the lightweight men group was such, and the women's group actually was such small groups within that. And their body masses and body shapes were similar to that of other sports that we were training in the same facility. It was really easy to compare them to the other sports in there, and you couldn't differentiate them based upon what they were doing within the weight room. That wasn't the differentiating factor between why. You get in terms of who was good and who wasn't good. They were in there with the very best of the athletes in that gym, within that gym, and they were competing with guys who you would say are some of the best speed, strength, or multi fitness based athletes in the country. Again, if not the world. There, that's fascinating when you have a lightweight male lifting in the weight room next to somebody who is held up as the kind of the fittest person within one of the other training programs, and they're lifting pound for pound exactly the same or moving in the same way. And like, yeah, okay, these guys are outstanding athletes and individuals.
Very cool. Very cool. So shifting gears, setting the stage for kind of strength and conditioning overall. So one of the things that you and Paul Thompson discuss in the book, Training for the Complete Rower, is kind of the training paradigm, right? And sort of this hierarchy going from skill development, conditioning training, the focus on high force production and speed, and then getting into kind of specific sports training and goals. So why is it important to kind of follow that progression or that hierarchy and respect it as a strength and conditioning coach in terms of athletic development? And then two, the evidence or supporting factors for strength and conditioning increasing force production and power production.
Okay. I have to admit, before coming on today, I had to reread some of my book chapter just to remember what I actually wrote. Luckily, most of it I still agree with, which is always a good thing. But that paradigm is an easy way, I suppose, to get people thinking about what is it you need rowers or athletes to be able to achieve at the end. And while movement and condition aren't the things that are going to make the rower boat faster, they are the things that are going to help them train better and train more effectively and closer to the intensities in the future of what is required. So the movement competency is critical. If you can't lift effectively that well, then the ability to develop your force and velocity characteristics are going to be limited. And if you can't produce high force and high velocity characteristics, then when you're actually trying to row, you're only going to row with the physical capabilities that you have, regardless of how technically gifted they are. And the human body self-organizes itself within any movement, but it will self-organize itself to what it's been exposed to and what it's capable of delivering. And in terms of that paradigm, that's one way of helping the athletes be able to be better at self-organizing itself by increasing its capability of going from a pretty good movement, the ability to repeat that movement under duress or stress and maintaining good technical competency, then the ability to genuinely expose that to some high force and high velocity based load, and then the more sport specific stuff, which is either on the water or if the water's bad, the ergometer. And that's kind of how I kind of crudely view it, as this paradigm of shifting through that. And it's not to say that you have to necessarily always follow that paradigm from start to finish, and like you can't move on to the next one until you're really good at that. It's making sure that there is a high degree of, particularly in the early years, of good movement competency and capacity to just generally train. I co-authored a paper recently, a couple of years ago now, around what we describe as work capacity, and work capacity is the ability to repeatedly load against maximal or submaximal loads to sustain higher degrees of workload, and that's not a performance characteristic. That's a training characteristic. The ability just to train more without breaking down from injury, or train more at higher intensities, is critical, and particularly in sports where there is a large volume of training. And I think that's really important. That middle step around that kind of work capacity and conditioning, because that does allow the athlete to sustain more. And if you can do the whole training program, the chances are you're gonna be successful. If you can't, then you're missing some type of training, and that's when it becomes a problem. So I think that's just it's a nice way to kind of look at it. And I think the bit I always go back to as well is, regardless of the level of athlete, there will always be components of all four of that in there, each of those steps in there. Maybe in the early years you do more of the bottom steps. As you progress through to more seniors and more high performance levels, you may do less of the bottom steps, but they're always present. And particularly when you're rehabbing from injuries, and just before we spoke on before we came to this call, we were chatting about lumbar spine and so on, and like those bottom levels become critical when someone's become injured, about rehearsing good movement quality, even from a local or a kind of larger global movement pattern. But the ability for the injured area to be able to tolerate more loading again, because often under fatigue is where those damaged areas or the injured areas break down again. And in a sport which is highly voluminous, then it's likely to break down again if we don't treat it with due care.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. That was fantastic. One point I would love for you to go a little bit deeper on. You said something that was great, just very, very good point. You talked about human beings being self-organizing kind of organisms in regards to movement, and whether it's skill in a specific sport or learning a lift. What do you mean by that? What makes us a self-organizing organism?
Well, when you get out of the chair, once you finish this call, your body will organize itself in the way in which it has to get out of that chair. Like, you don't think about it; it self-regulates itself at that point. Now, if you've got, it's easy to talk from an injury point of view. If you say you have patellar tendinopathy and you have pain in one of your knees, the chances are when you plant your feet on the floor to step out of the chair, you'll place more load through one side of your body than the side which has got the tendinopathy to avoid pain. So the body will self-organize itself to avoid certain pain or certain movements, and that's an artificial constraint on the body. Like, it's pain, it's injury, but the body will organize itself to avoid that. However, like, once you recover from that and you never have that problem again, you may still have some lag from that self-organization that the body will, if it was in the right knee, you may always, as you get out of the chair, lean to the left-hand side to get off that, because the movement pattern has self-organized itself so well that it just keeps rehearsing that pattern. And then if you put that in kind of a performance point of view, when you're looking at how someone rows, for instance, the body will work out the position that it needs to get into, and it may not be the position that coaches and physicians and support staff want them to get into, but it will organise itself in a way which it feels is the most effective way to deliver that movement outcome, or that coordination task. If it's not what's quite right, then what's actually limiting it? Is it are they just getting in a poor position and actually just simply instructing? Does that put them into a better position? It might do, it might not do. Do you have to actually change the technical the technical model and actually put some kind of intervention or constraint on them to force them to change that movement. So again, they reorganize themselves based upon that constraint. And that's where this is where it becomes interesting around, is it purely a movement or is it a movement and a physicality? Like if they're collapsing through the lumbar spine while rowing, they may not have the physicality to have enough trunk bracing capability through a loading task. So no matter what constraint you place upon them or movement competency you ask them to do, they may never do that. They will just organize themselves with what they're capable of doing, and until you change that capability. So if you suddenly give them a load of trunk loading and you increase that trunk stiffness so they're no longer collapsing, that doesn't guarantee that they won't collapse, but you've increased the potential and their capacity to do that. Now, we as coaches and practitioners have to identify ways of exposing that individual to utilize that new capacity. So again, can you manipulate the task? Can you manipulate the environment or change how the individual operates within that to almost force them into transferring that new capability into the task? So that's kind of the way I kind of view the world. I suppose it's kind of a very dynamical system approach of task, environment, and individual, how you can constrain or optimize one part of one of those areas to really amplify and really kind of put a lot of pressure on the movement or the position you really need them to get into. And that's what I mean by, I suppose, self-organizing. The body will do whatever it needs to do. It's our jobs as coaches and practitioners to help them do it in a way which we think is more optimal.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's, doesn't show up on a training log sheet on the strength and conditioning side, but so many of the intangibles that you just spoke about there. You're teaching the athlete better body awareness and how they're moving through space. And then on the flip side, okay, they now become sort of self-aware on their own without you. And am I doing that on the erg? Am I doing that in the boat? Am I carrying myself in a better supported posture? Is that translating over into, a longer steady state session? And then when I go up to, higher intensity under, high duress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk because I'm not a rowing coach. I can't really talk about it from a rowing stroke perspective, but from a weightlifting skill, there are things that I've done in the weight room to help people change their movement pattern, or change the focus on what the outcome is of the task, so that they're more aware of what needs to happen. So often rowers, when they Olympic lift and power clean, because of the rowing stroke is a backwards action, they always pull their elbows towards the back and not up towards the ceiling in the end of the second pull. So they always end up having to wrestle this bar up their chest, and actually just that's the defining factor which makes their lift successful or not. So actually making them aware of them, that actually the task completion or task success is more about where they get their elbow position, rather than if they've lifted the load. We've been able to manipulate the kind of the environment to put kind of bands where their elbows have to touch, so they know that they're actually getting into those kind of positions. If athlete, and this actually isn't a rowing example, but when athletes have been pulling too early on their arms in the Olympic lift, for instance, I've pre-fatigued their arms by just bicep curling them to failure, so that they actually can't really bend their elbow. They've got no force left to kind of bend their elbows, so they have to find some other way to self-organize themselves to get that bar onto the catch position without using their arms. And lo and behold, because their arms are no longer used in the lift as much as they were, they've had to use the hips a lot more, so the lift looks and feels like an Olympic lift, rather than it being this kind of single pull from the floor. And so there's little things you can do there where you can manipulate the environment or the individual, or you can just change the task slightly to make it a bit more a bit different for them. And again, that reinforces that kind of what position they really need to get into, or what the outcome really is. And you can, that again, the body will self-organize itself based upon what it's exposed to. And the beauty of it is some of it will work, some of it won't work. We have two athletes and you apply the same thing. It works for one, it doesn't work the other. You have to find the one that does continually do that, and then find the ways to continue to reinforce that week in, week out. Because if you expose them to once, it's nice, but the week after it's back to where it was. Like, how do you continually expose them so that it becomes the pattern or the movement or the self-organization that's required, not this one-off event which happened 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, I love that, and I guess that's the part where science meets art and the coaching. Absolutely,
and that for me, like, the reason why most people get into strength conditioning isn't probably because I'm sure people do actually, but like, the reason why I got into it is like I love reading, and I love the science, and I love all of that side, but the bit that connects me to it all is the art of coaching. And it's like, you have to figure out what's in front of you, to do something with the person in front of you to make them a little bit better than when they were before they walked into the weight room that day. And that's the bit I love. Kind of just you're throwing this athlete with these groups of athletes, and like, you've got to do something with them, and it can't be the same generic stuff you've done week on week on week. It has to be something which is moving them forward. And figuring that out, and that whole problem solving bit is a bit which I think a lot of people get into coaching for, that because it is a very unique environment to do it in.
Yes, absolutely. It's like this, it's kind of like an open-ended equation that you're always sort of working on and refining.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably it will never be finished either. You're in 30 years' time, you'll still be asking yourself the same question and be maybe a fractional bit closer to that question. But
right. That was great. So, okay. So stepping back again and looking at S&C. So you gave us kind of the paradigm, overview of progression there. So you have two athletes coming to you. One is, a junior, and then one, say, is going to be on the, U23 or senior team. Where would you start from an evaluation, movement evaluation, and then testing standpoint, assessment? What are some of the things that you want to get a baseline for before you begin that program? And then, are there things that you automatically, as a strength and conditioning coach, you feel that the younger athlete needs more in terms of, because of athletic development?
Yeah, I think the monitoring of athletes is important. I think I've softened my view on some of the way I do the testing and monitoring, as partly because if you throw an athlete that you've never met straight into testing that they've probably never been exposed to, they're always going to look a little bit worse than they really are. So I often now is just expose them to training first, like not kind of full on maximal volume and intensity based training, but just expose them to training and just see how they respond. And what I mean by respond is, like, do they quickly make progressions, and actually movement competency or capacity naturally changes just by some basic exposure to that. And I often go around that route rather than doing this kind of testing, monitoring stuff at the very beginning. And the critical bit with all of this, and this is not just a rowing thing; it's a testing, training kind of thing. Is what is the purpose for testing, and how is that testing related back to the performance? So it's all very well saying, I test. I don't know. We look at ergo power strokes on the ergometer. Like, are we sure that's a really good measure of something, or what's it actually measuring, and is it sensitive enough for us to track change? So that's a bit I always go back to. Like it almost doesn't matter what you do, as long as one, it's a valid test of the thing you're trying to test. Two, it's reliable enough so that it's completed in a way which means it will continually tell you what it's supposed to be telling you. And then is it sensitive enough? So if you see change in that, does that change, or how much of a change do you need to see in that before for you to know it to be something meaningful? And the reason why I go through a lot of that, I've spent a lot of time focusing on this over the last probably 5 or 6 years, is we have loads of tests. Some of them we know are really good, some of them we don't know so much. And we make assumptions that if you see a change in that's a positive. Yet we don't know how much of a change actually is a positive. So before we even get to that point, just know that those, validity, reliability, and sensitivity, if you're on top of those, then your test will be fairly useful. I often look at on those bottom two tiers of the paradigm we discussed earlier around movement. I tend not to do a movement competency in a kind of a separate, but I tend to observe them in the weight room and kind of just see how they move, and just you'll get better understanding of how they move in that setting than in an unloaded, uncoordinated task, which actually I'm not that worried about. And then you can, from that, I can then start working out whether or not that's a local joint range of movement issue, or if it's a capacity issue, or it's a strength deficit, and you can start just exploring that. When we start looking at some of the kind of like the higher force and power tests in the book, we talk about sort of doing sort of jump testing and some ergometer testing on kind of like the power strokes, but they are they're valid tests of producing power in a varying stroking action on a non-water based piece of equipment, but it gives you a fairly strong understanding of how much power they can produce. And ultimately, I think that's as close as you can probably get before you start doing some proper mechanical testing or transferring onto the water. But I think if you see changes in those kind of ergometer bits, you're probably doing something right. If you're not, then if it's not changing, it's like, well, look at the program first and see actually what you're trying to change. And I think that's often the bit when you're looking at testing and the training program there that's designed to change those tests, is things tend to fall between the gaps a little bit. So when you're talking about we're going to do a maximal strength training session and we're going to do 4 sets of 5 repetitions, well, if you have a 70 kilo female squatting 4 sets of 5 at 40 kilos, that's not really a maximal force training for the legs, because it's 40 kilos, and probably what's limiting them isn't their ability of their legs to load, it's probably the ability of their spine to tolerate the 40 kilos. So that's a bit which I often go back to. The testing tells you one bit, but the review of the program tells you the other bit. If things haven't changed, it's you need to look at the test as a valid and reliable measure, but also just how effective the program has been. And the third bit is around you as a coach. What environment have you created for them to create this change? So I know it's going slightly off topic, but I think you can't talk about testing without talking about the other side, because actually the test is a measure of the success of the training program and the training environment you've created for that individual, as much as it is a measure of the change in the physical or the movement or the competency you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. You said something just now that was very interesting to me, and I would love to get your kind of opinion and insight on this from all your years of experience. Do you feel that rowers have a lower tolerance in loading the spine? Like, so, obviously their legs are very strong. They're using them all the time, right? But like on a strength and conditioning sense, if they were doing a back squat with a barbell versus maybe say a lunge or a split squat, they don't have that load directly over the spine. Do you feel, because of the nature of the sport, but kind of overall, there's a lower tolerance to directly load the spine from the top down compressively?
Yeah, we were talking about it before we came online, around like Fiona Wilson's work, and there's some work from Professor Alison McGregor's lab in Imperial College in London, some of her PhD students that have looked at at spinal loading and how spinal loading changes the force dynamics of horizontal leg force and just like the simple answer to it is yes. Like there is a massive concern around, and this isn't just for rowers as well, but just athletes generally. I would say that lumbar spines are expected to tolerate a huge amount of force while doing most activities, if not all activities, and often it becomes the limiting point of movement, because it can't tolerate those kind of compressive and shear loads through spinal loading. And you're talking about split squats and sort of using dumbbells and so on. Like they have the potential to be an alternative, but the bit I always go back to is like, can you load if you're doing sort of dumbbell based loading? Can you load it like super maximally above that of what, almost similar to that of a squat? And sort of some of the sort of early work I did years and years ago with athletics was looking at how much load or how much force does a single limb produce compared to the bilateral equivalent. So if you did we did some isometric leg testing, and let's say for non-injured healthy athletes, they were able to, on a single limb, they could produce 70% or above force of what they could do for the bilateral equivalent. So on a single leg, they could produce 70% of what they could on double leg. And that was really evident on loads and loads of athletes we looked at. We rarely did any training on single leg, yet those scores would continue to change as we did more double leg training. They did their sports training and so on. And so that got me thinking about, well, how much load would you need to do on a single leg in strength training terms for it to be enough of a load to stimulate the same adaptation you're looking for if you were doing on two legs? So if you couldn't squat and you're going to do a split squat or lunge, like would you need to do 70% of what you could do on a double leg as you could on a single leg? And so if you could back squat 100 kilos for 5 reps on a back squat, you'd have to do 70 kilos for a lunge for 5 reps, for instance. That's what I was kind of getting to. I don't know if it's probably quite a crude way of looking at it, but it holds some weight around, like if you're generally going after a change in the knee and hip extensors force application, then you need to put that hip and knee under a high degree of load to do that. And if you're only squatting 40 kilos, you're never going to do that. And you may, even with 70 kilo dumbbells in your hands on a single leg, that still may not be enough. It might need to be, I don't know, it just needs to be really, really high to properly overload the system. Because if you're not overloading the system, it's just body training, which doesn't really change that side of it all. So I don't really have an answer, but the bit I always go back to is, if the load is high enough, you will get the adaptation you require. If it's not high enough, it's not high enough volume for it to be more capacity based, and it's not high enough intensity for it to be force based. So what is actually changing? And that's why I talk about it falling through the gaps. Like, does it fall through the gap because it's not quite high enough intensity and it's not enough volume? So I'd always go back to my program and the environment I've created to see, okay, while I've prescribed that, it hasn't changed. So why hasn't it changed?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, that was great. That was very insightful, and really fascinating hearing kind of your experience and thoughts with the comparison to the unilateral versus bilateral work and stuff, and definitely gives me some things to think about. That's very cool. So finishing out my original question before I took you on a tangent there. So if you're working with two rowers, a junior versus kind of a more, seasoned, somebody that's been in the system, just from overall junior, a younger athlete, is there something that you would have that individual emphasize more just in terms of athletic development? Like, are you going to spend more time working on the movement competency, the skills, rather than, moving a heavier load or a supermax load or moving at speed, because they're just trying to develop the ability to, move safely and efficiently with a bar or, with dumbbells or kettlebells.
Yeah. I've been fortunate enough to work across development pathways in maybe 5 or 6 sports. And I'm not sure if I'm going to say is just a representation of what we've done, or it's something I believe we should do. And I'll probably come out as I start talking. But fundamentally, athletes have to prepare for the rigors of senior competition, and the training rigor that comes with that. If we use a paradigm we spoke about earlier, I've spent a large amount of time preparing athletes along the kind of the work capacity and the conditioning bit of just being able to tolerate lots more work, because you can if you haven't got a large amount of load, you can put that load on them, but do the multiple repetitions of it. And while you produce a capacity to tolerate that, as you get closer to near maximal failure, or getting to failure, or getting to high repetitions to under a high degree of stress, the muscular system will actually start having to work against, will have to work harder, and the muscle contraction will have to be more forceful as you become more fatigued. So you do start developing some of those kind of force characteristics you need, although the load may not be what we traditionally say is as high. So that's where I tend to spend probably the majority of the time for those younger athletes. The capacity, the movement bit is critical as well. Is just being able to expose them to more. If an athlete becomes, if they've only ever squatted, for instance, and they let's say they injure their ankle, but their knee and hip is still functional, then do we limit their ability to do anything else because they've only ever squatted, because they haven't learned how to do, I don't know, hip bridging or things like that, and suddenly you limit their trainability because they've only got one way to solve a force or velocity characteristic problem. How can we increase them to have multiple solutions for doing that? So that's why I tend to expose them to lots. And I think finally, and this is the point I tend to leave with most people who work in development pathways, like maximal motor unit recruitment, or the ability to produce a maximal muscular contraction, is a skill in itself. And how often do we expose young athletes to that? So I'm not advocating maximal squatting to elicit that, but you can do partner resisted isometric based trainings where you can understand what a maximal motor unit recruitment is, or high maximal muscle contraction is. And if we don't expose them to that, do we limit them in that transitioning period into a senior bit? So I haven't got an answer to that, but it's a question I ask myself a lot. And I was chatting to a colleague a couple of weeks ago, a guy called Richie Wall, who's starting a PhD in this area, and the question I asked him is, like, it'd be fascinating just to explore, like, what does maximal motor unit recruitment really mean, and how do we if everything we're talking about is skill development, but in terms of movement, surely the ability to the body to contract and the muscles to contract is also a skill in that sense. So how do we also put the same amount of attention onto that to prepare them? So that would be a fascinating bit to discover. But as I say, it's a full, not a methodology I've ever really spent a lot of time delivering on, because I just haven't been exposed to that kind of world recently.
Yeah, that's an area that I'm reading kind of more into, but increasing the ability to recruit more motor units, you're going to give the athlete, the individual, greater ability to produce higher neural drive. And so that impulse, from the brain down to the muscle, it's going to be that much stronger. So it's like that signal that's going is they're going to be able to produce that much force, but perhaps over time their perceived rate of exertion is lower, potentially. potentially. But, being able to kind of, the other part of it, I think that's really interesting too, is practicing that skill, that mindset. You're really developing the ability as an athlete, right? To turn it on, turn it off, right? Relax, contract. And that's kind of, sport as a whole. You have those two phases, especially in rowing. It is clearly, the drive and recovery phase, but in most other sports, there's usually some part, that's working, and then the other parts, relaxing and stuff, and teaching the athlete to do that. That's why I think some isometrics are very, very valuable in the sense that, especially from a development standpoint, and younger adolescents, they spend so much time sitting that they have just very poor body awareness at that age, because they're not sure how they're moving, and how do I maintain a neutral spine in a plank position, and how does that translate to the push-up or the top of the deadlift or a clean or any of that type of stuff, when they get under load.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those bits become quite important, because the contract, relax, just understanding like what it is to have to move something move a high load, or move something under really high speed, becomes that's often quite a unique task or skill for some individuals if they haven't been exposed to that before, and it takes a long time. And I've worked with athletes in other sports where they've never really got it because they've come to it so late, and you can't afford to spend huge amounts of time on that, because it takes time away from other types of training which become more essential. So that's why I always tend to look at it as when athletes are developing, if we give them the capability to train by the time they get to a senior program, we potentially have an opportunity to use all these methods and ways to develop them without being constrained by what they can't do.
Right. So which kind of leads me into my next question. So you talk a lot about this in the book, and this is great. So from preparing the rower over the course of the entire year, so kind of looking at a macro scale, how do you what do strength and conditioning coaches need to do, make sure they're doing a good job of, to complement those kind of different periods? So you have a off season base building period, and then pre-competition, and then they're getting into the regatta season. So what are things that are like important to emphasize during the base building, and then as you get in the regatta season, what are things like that you don't want to do that are going to directly conflict or take away from what they're doing, racing or on the water?
Yeah. If I go in reverse and go to racing and
Sure.
kind of the regatta bit, I think pretty much most things will, if it's not on the water or or directly related to water performance, will slow them down. Which is why we often, like for some athletes, they may stop weight training weeks in advance because it's too much of a residual carryover of fatigue from it, and actually they've got what they've got now, and it doesn't matter what you do. Others feel the need to continue some type of training within that training program.
Do you think that residual fatigue, is that more muscular or is that more nervous system?
Good question. I suspect it's both. I suspect if you're doing enough training, you'll end up centrally being fatigued. But if you do it sporadically, it'll be more local and muscular, and often, which is, and again, I don't know if I've got any evidence of this whatsoever, but muscle soreness creates changes in the way the rowers move in the boat. So if that muscle soreness is coming from the weight room, that's massively more detrimental than them not having that at all. So if you're going to, for me, if you're going to strength train, you have to have enough dosages for you never to have muscle soreness between that. So then you have to start looking at the periodization of how far those sessions are away from each other. We're not saying it's 3 times a week. It can be 3 over 10 days or 6 over 20 days. I don't know, whatever it might be and whatever works. But so I do think there is a bit of both. I think again the book describes the need to continually work on range of movement and trunk trunk capacity or just the ability to hold positions. And I think that becomes really important in that there's each nation or each club will have a technical model of how they want to work. Having good range of movement around the ankles, hips, and thoracic spine, having good trunk positions to hold the torso in the correct position while not collapsing during the stroke is important, and be able to have long lats, be able to have the arms out when the blade's about to enter the water at the catch. All of those kind of things, they're things that support the technical model, and the technical model is the thing that delivers the 250 odd strokes over a 2,000 meter race. And I think those things are essential to maintain throughout, and the book describes that in a way which it's supportive of the technical model. It's not the thing which is the thing that's going to make them win the boat, because win the race. Then rowing is going to do that, and then the rest of it is stuff which can be they're negotiables, I suppose. And you can, depending on the individual, depending on the boat and the crew and so on, you can make a decision on what that is. In the winter, or kind of the traditional September through to racing season, that's probably the biggest block of time where you don't have as much. You might have some head races and so on, but it doesn't tend to be the biggest period of racing. So you have a large amount of time to develop technical and physical qualities, and again, that's dependent on how the coach and the program looks at what the most important things. I think the bit I describe in the book is that it's a good opportunity to work on things that you're not going to have time to work on when it gets closer to the regatta period. So you'll have more opportunities to do strength training and strength training based tasks in the winter than you will when you're getting into the pre-season and the season. So how do you manage to develop that enough for it to carry through for the rest of the season? So the book will describe having enough of that dosages, and then at the point at which it gets pulled away, how much do you need to keep it ticking over, and at what point do you entirely remove it? And actually that can be taken over by much more task specific force and power production. So there's bits around how you can manipulate the water work or the ergometer work to do some of the shorter power bits. So, and I think that's quite a nice bit how Tomo and I wrote the book, in that we contributed or influenced how each chapter was written. So while it is clear that I wrote some of the chapters and Tomo's written a number of those chapters, we both engage in that, like how each of the bits support each other. And that becomes really important of like, how do you know when enough is enough in the weight room, and actually the water and the ergo work that Paul will start prescribing, and the way in which he prescribes it will be enough to continue to allow those components. And that's why I'm actually quite proud of the book. I've written a few book chapters, but this book is the one which it really talks about that integration of me supporting the philosophical approach of Paul and how he believes he can deliver a gold medal winning performance, and how do I support him to do that. It's not, strength conditioning isn't this kind of add-on to his program. It's entirely aligned to his program. So when he says we're going to do this type of training, my bit is like, well, how does that fit into it, and how long do I need to do that before actually I don't need to do that anymore and need to introduce something else to support the next bit of his training. And that's, I think, hopefully that comes through in the book, that it's not this addition to training. It's just a part of training, and it fits within the training program based upon how the head coach Paul wants to win medals, and that's where I think it becomes critical, is just knowing what they want and how it supports what they want.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the themes in the book that was very, very clear to me from reading. And I thought you both did a beautiful job in getting that across. And that's such a key, again, this is such a key kind of tenet between, the actual sport and then what you're doing on the strength and conditioning side, is that they're not separate. They have to complement one another. And it was really evident in the writing of the book, and then being a reader reading it, is that how kind of open the communication was between both of you, because you could look and know what the training program they were doing on a given day on their sessions, and then, okay, this is what we need to be doing in the weight room respectively, and this is going to add to what they're doing and not take away. And I think that's like probably one of the biggest challenges in any sport is, you're trying to build injury resilience and enhance performance, but you're not trying to have the athletes show up to their training session in their respective sport, so sore they can't move, or they're not able to do the training session.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Like we worked really hard on the book to try and make it feel like a collaboration and not just these adjuncts. But we worked even harder in real life to actually make it work when we're doing this. And I'm sure if you talk to Paul and talk to me now, like we made mistakes, and we always did. But because we were open enough to know where that mistake came from, and we weren't judgmental about, well, that was your fault or my fault. It was like, well, we did that, it didn't quite work out, let's move on to the next bit. Like we worked really hard to get to that point, and I think that's often the bit which I see now, particularly with kind of younger coaches coming through. They're getting loads of experience, and I call it accountable coaching experience. And what I mean by accountable is like, are you aligned to a coach's philosophy or performance, whatever that performance is? And if you're not, it's just coaching, and you're judging yourself about what you're doing within your sessions rather than what the coach is trying to achieve as a performance piece. And Tomo and I worked really, really hard to kind of make sure I wasn't making strength conditioning look good. I was trying to make the performance, help his performances and the athlete's performances look really, really good. But it's hard to do that when you're not entirely integrated with what the coach is doing and why their model of performance is like that, and getting under the bonnet of it is like, well, why is that part of the tactical model so important? And when I understood that, I was like, okay, I understand where I can have an impact on that. But often we've we tend to do our normal needs analysis of, we'll read the research, and the research says it's you produce X amount of force per rowing stroke, and you've got to be able to sustain 75% of that for the remaining of the race. Well, that's all very nice, but that doesn't tell me how Paul wanted to deliver that and how that technical model works. When I found that out, the needs analysis helped that, but the needs analysis was redundant until I had that understanding of what the coach really, really wanted.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's just wonderful advice, especially for a younger guy like me, still learning and developing.
So am I.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. So there's always room to improve and get better, right?
Well, absolutely. If we didn't believe that, then these podcasts wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't be on Twitter, and we wouldn't be reading and connecting with loads of people on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you want to touch on the S&C side, or just to summarize, or anything that we haven't talked about before we move into the rapid fire questions?
No, I think you've exhausted me. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right. So these are not related to the topics we have down. I ask each guest these. These are just a good opportunity for you to kind of open up and share a little bit more about yourself, and for the audience to get to know you. So, Alex, given all your knowledge and experience you've accumulated up to this point in your career, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself 10 years ago?
Oh, good question. Be patient, be persistent, and it's okay to make mistakes.
Awesome. if you had to pick one, and this doesn't have to be for rowers, like this could be your personal favorite. What's your favorite strength training exercise?
Favorite strength training exercise. This is purely personal, and there's nothing to do with any athlete I've ever worked with. But I love snatching, and I don't know why. It just feels like when you've got a weight above your head, you feel like Hercules. So like that's why I do it.
I love it. How has your training changed today, present day, compared to 10 years ago?
It is a lot simpler. It is a lot clearer. I think I could probably define my training as being aligned to coach's philosophy of performance. It's adaptation led, and it's athlete centered. And I don't think I was clear on that 10 years ago. I thought everything was important, but actually it's simpler. I understand what I'm trying to change and how I can create an environment to allow that athlete to make that change.
I love that. That's a great quote. I wrote that down. Is your training adaptation led and athlete centered? I love that.
You can have that.
Yeah, that's good. Have you ever had an injury? And if so, how did that injury affect your training?
Yeah, I've had loads of injuries, mostly self-inflicted. So I had my ankle reconstructed about 10 years ago. And before I got it reconstructed, I had a really floppy ankle, which meant every time I had tried to do any kind of ground-based training, I could feel my tibia and fibula sort of just moving across my foot, and I had no stability. And then when I had it reconstructed, I had literally no movement in my ankle, and that then I had to work really hard on that, and it really affected my right knee and hip, and to a point where I got some quite bad tendinopathy and some what did I get? Had some labral issues because the range of movement deficit in my ankle resulted in excessive range of movement in knee and hip, which then caused me more problems, of which I'm likely to have to get a hip arthroscopy at some point in the next couple of years.
Are you doing okay now, though?
Well, I don't train now, so it's all right. I just sit at my laptop, so I'm fine. Yeah.
What is one thing that high school athletes should be doing more of to complement their training and their health?
I don't think there's enough attention given to well-being and fulfillment. And actually, I just went. You just caught me on a day. I just been to my old high school this morning and spent a couple of hours down there meeting up with a couple of the old teachers and trying to do a project that's with them, to a collaborative project around that. And we were talking exactly around well-being. Like why would people want to do this stuff in the first place? And actually, the fulfillment it has to be the driver. If you're not happy doing it, like find something that is happy, that does make you happy. And I think that's really, really, really important, that we put such a big emphasis on exercise and health, but find something which genuinely makes you happy, and don't worry about what other people think, because life's too short.
Yeah, that's right, man. That's right. What's your best tip to improve recovery after a training session?
Sleep.
Nice.
Yeah, let's keep it that. Yeah.
Okay. What advice would you give to rowers? How would you advise rowers from your own experiences to row faster? So, like, what's one thing you would say, if you added this in, this is going to help you to gain, speed on the ergometer or speed in the boat?
Intent, and what I mean by that is directed mental effort. Like, do they understand what intent means? And it's not talking about going maximal. It's about the right amount of effort required to deliver that task, whatever that task may be.
Love it. Okay, last three are real fun. So, what's your favorite meal?
Oh, easy. Roast dinner. Mum's roast dinner.
Nice. What's one book everyone should read?
Oh dear. want to give you 30 books. I'm going to give you two because I can't do one. Sure. One is Start with Why by Simon Sinek. Yeah, like love it. It really just got my head thinking about why we do what we do. And the other one is Collective Genius, which talks about how if we all work together and we don't judge people and we allow people to express their opinions, like what we could really achieve in this world. And I love the idea of like everyone's creative, and if we put all that creativity together, something great will happen.
Excellent. Final question. Who do you study or have you studied in your career to improve and get better?
Who have I studied?
Yeah.
Did you say? I'm gonna go back. Many people may not know this person because he was probably my first mentor back in the early days. There's a guy called Tommy Yule who is now the head of performance support at British Athletics, but he was performance director at British Weightlifting and was a strength and conditioning coach before that. And he's represented the country in Commonwealth and Olympic Games in weightlifting, and the way in which he held me to account around what I do and his understanding of just the bit he maybe forced me to do is about just being clear about what I'm talking about, and his weightlifting model and the way in which he viewed training. He forced me to look at it entirely different. So when I say study, it's he's probably the person which I've studied in terms of just what he does and how he does it, I suppose.
That's great. That's great. Alex, you're off the hot seat. That wraps up the end of the interview. Thank you so much for coming on. I learned so much from you this morning. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad we got to pseudo meet over Skype.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, and hopefully I haven't gassed on too much about irrelevant stuff. So hopefully it's been useful.
Absolutely, it has. Absolutely has. Just hang on the line. Let me give you a proper goodbye off air.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.